do that. So without any further
One on the
ado,
wall?
yeah, here, or tonight, right here. Take it away.
Okay.
Good evening, and thanks for coming out to all of you. By the way, there's competition tonight because it seems likely there's going to be the Aurora Borealis again rocking. So you can get out in the country away from the city lights and see that. I saw it last night. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, I've been seeing pictures. I'm jealous of people who don't go to bed by 10 p.m. I'll just say very quickly, my name is Ksenya Gurshtein. You're wondering what I'm doing here. I'm an art historian. I have a particular interest in photography, and I've known Philip. We were trying to figure out, I think since 2021, when I was a curator at the Ulrich Museum, and we did an exhibition with some of his work, and actually some of the work that's in this room. So I've been following this particular project for a few years, and have been a really, really big fan of his work. So he asked me to be in conversation with him, and that's my purpose here. To start with, as Trish said, Philip has been a professional photographer for decades. He's worked in both art photography and commercial photography. He's worked with some really famous people you might have heard of, like
Irving Penn, Joel Meyerowitz, Philip Lorca de Corsia.
I didn't want to get it wrong, and so to open with, I was going to ask Philip to talk a little bit about the evolution of his work, sort of where he started, where he is now, and he's made a number of books of his photographs, so he's going to talk about images, and then since this is a small enough group, we can pass them around, and hopefully you guys can see what he's talking about as they go. So I gave him the limit of 5 images. So talk about your whole career, but like in 5 key images that tell us something about, where it started, how it's going.
Actually, I didn't bring examples of my earliest work. So basically, as a kid, I fell in love with photography the way kids do, because cameras are cool, and the family had a Polaroid camera, which don't exist anymore, but were miracles. And then when I was 12 years old, in junior high school, I was a teaching assistant for the art teacher, and in there I learned to mix photochemistry and process black and white film and make black and white prints, and just kind of played with it, and I never took it seriously. And at that point in my life, the only photography I'd seen was magazine photography like National Geographic, Sports Illustrated, the occasional Playboy magazine that you'd find in a dumpster or whatever, and Ansel Adams. And Ansel Adams at that time I didn't understand. It was just this kind of, it took me a long time to learn to appreciate his work. And so when I went to college, I ended up studying painting instead of photography. And in the last semester of my painting studies, I took a photography class thinking I was going to learn to make transparencies of my paintings so I could apply for grad school or grants or whatever, and just took to the material of the class like a fish to water. And because I'd already had a lot of experience with all the technical parts of photography, my teacher cut me loose after a couple of weeks, and the day he did that, he loaned me a couple of books. He loaned me The Americans by Robert Frank and Park City by Louis Baltz. And the very sophisticated, powerful books. And when I got home with them that night, I looked through them, and this whole world of possibility opened up, and I just was like, I've just spent 4 years of my life studying painting, and now I realize I'm a photographer, and that this was my life's calling. It really happened in one night, particularly looking through the Louis Baltz book, which at the time had just recently been published. This is in 1982, so 40 some odd years ago, 43 years ago. And it just seemed to encapsulate so many ideas that I was struggling with and not finding satisfaction with in painting. It was grounded in the real world, it was grounded in real experience, and yet it had all of the conceptual and I guess conceptual is the only word for it, aspects of expression and human endeavor that captivated me all within the medium. So from there, I just kind of started making pictures, and as soon as I graduated from college, I moved to Paris and started studying photography there, which was very different than the perception of photography in the United States. So I think that's had a pretty big influence on my work. That it's sort of somewhere out in the middle of the Atlantic. It's not typically American work, but it's also not typically European work. And then I was also, although I lived in Paris, I spent a year living in San Francisco, and then a year also in Lawrence, Kansas, a few months in Italy. So I was moving around a lot and exploring the world and trying to understand how photography was going to marry with that. So I ended up having a real wrestling match with the idea of style and taking on a project as an artist, or building a body of work, because as soon as you do that, you cut everything else out. And I just wanted to be able to make art out of everything. I just wanted to be as free as possible. And I would take on projects and think, well, maybe this is going to be a series or whatever. For instance, when I was living in France, I got very interested in sculptures that were eroding out in nature and turning back into rough stone. And so they'd been carved to resemble something usually anthropomorphic, and now they were turning back into rough stone, and you could find them that were just on the verge of being stone again. So I got very interested in that and did kind of a series about it, but it just never, it always seemed kind of contrived and forced on me to do that. Because as soon as I was looking at that, then I'd turn around and see something else that had the possibility of being a photograph. So I eventually became conscious of this and embraced it, instead of, like, the thing I was telling myself at the time is that, you're just not a good artist because you haven't found your style or your theme or your project or whatever. Or, you're just not mature or whatever. But really what it was I was just interested in everything, and I wanted to find another way to create photographs that wasn't limited, that would allow me to make work anywhere, everywhere, however, whenever. And that eventually merged into, like I said, a conscious awareness in the late 90s, when I started editing a body of work that eventually became this book right here called Code. And so the premise of this book is that, most photo books are like, they're about like surfers, or, the Mennonite people and Amish people in Pennsylvania, or something like that. They have some kind of really clear subject. Or they're about the artist, the famous artists, and it's the artist is like a survey of their work. But I wanted to make a book that was entirely related on a visual structure, that didn't have necessarily a verbal subject matter. You couldn't say the book is about Eskimos or about pinball. That the pictures would just relate one to the other and create an overall structure as you went through the sequence of the book.
Would you say the book was about photography and like what photography does to images, or how it creates images?
I guess so. And really, ultimately, photography is about life. So that's what I wanted to do with the book, was to use photography to, once again, just open it up and make it so that life and art could really intersect and merge and be one. So the book started actually with a pair of photographs that I took in 1990. Let me find them. I was walking down the street in Paris, and I saw this storefront that had mirrors on it, and shot this sequence. And then as I was editing the film, I just loved the process of the red light turning to the green light, and the people stopping and going, and then the division, the symmetry of the pictures, and I decided I wanted to put that in the middle of a body of work. So that's how the book started. It started in the middle. And then over the years, I'd be going along photographing, and I'd shoot 5,000 pictures, and 10 of them would be keepers. 10 of them would have something that I couldn't quite understand that made me want to look at them longer or hold on to them somehow, not just have them be, well, that's done. And so that pile eventually grew and grew and grew, and I started editing those pictures in a sequence into this book. And it took years. I mean, I started working on it in 1999, and I didn't finish it till 2008. And I did another revision then in 2015, I think it was. But things happen in the book, like for instance, this is a scale model of the city of New York at the Queens Museum of Art. And then this is the view out of my apartment building. So this is a simulacra, and it's a photograph of a model. And then this is the real thing, and it's a photograph. So there's this interplay throughout. For instance, there are movie sets in here. Well, this is at the Nelson Atkins Museum. This is a set piece of a room in some kind of chateau or something, and then this is a taxidermist shop. So there are fake things that look real and real things that look fake. This once again is the view out of my apartment window. And then there are also a lot of hallways and suggestions of travel. This is a view from an airplane of the Terminator, the dividing line between night and day. And then here's night, so we're flying into the night, and here's the model, and here's the real thing. This again is a view of my apartment window. This is a few days after September 11th when there was this crazy rainstorm. This is my sister's Arabian stallion. And so you can see how would these pictures relate. You couldn't put them under a topic like life in New York City. It wouldn't work that way. But you can also see there is kind of a relationship between them. I mean, maybe it's subjective, but that's okay. Artists make subjective choice all the time, and I think they look great together. We've got a passage. I was walking around in Brooklyn, and there was a fellow on his back playing the trumpet, something out of a dream. This is a movie set at Universal City in Los Angeles, and then this is a view of a building facade in New York City. So this sofa here is symmetrical and kind of divided in the middle, so it's a little bit of foreshadowing about the symmetry of the book. So I don't want to spend all night talking about it, and there are a lot of crazy things that happened in the editing of the book. The first half of the book doesn't have as many people in it. The second half has a lot of portraits of people and people doing things. But I'll give you an example of the kind of things that happened in editing it that really sort of impressed me. So when I first moved into my apartment in Brooklyn after I'd been living in Paris, I was on the 4th floor of the building, and when people would come and visit me, they'd look out the window and say, "So, are you going to photograph out the window of your apartment every day?" And I was like, "I don't know, this is such a corny idea." Well, sure enough, after living there 6 months, I looked out my window and I saw this scene with this ice cream truck and these identical twin kids down here with the Twin Towers visible in the background right up here. So I could see the World Trade Center from my living room window. And then this gorgeous light. And so this is the first picture I took out of my living room window there in Brooklyn. Well, in this picture, there's a little fellow that I didn't notice until 2015 when I revised the book for the last time. I was scanning the negatives to make digital files of all of them and really working on them so that I can print them digitally and have them be edition prints, which means you go over every last little detail in every single picture and adjust it and make sure everything's clean and right. So I noticed this fellow standing right here, this little tiny figure. You can see he's scratching his head. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so then time goes on, and I'm photographing out my window. There's some other views out my window. And then I wake up on September 11th, 2001, and out my window, I see the World Trade Center on fire. So I watched that happen from my living room window and photographed it, actually. And that's a whole story in and of itself, and there's a body of work that evolved out of that day. And then later that afternoon, there's no more World Trade Center. So this is the last picture I took with the World Trade Center in the picture. This is the first picture I took after the World Trade Center was gone. And there's that guy, that little tiny guy, scratching his head. Okay? And before I realized that that guy was in there, it's symmetrical in the book. Like there's roughly the same number of pages before and after. So I did that subconsciously. And there are 4 or 5 other incidences like that where my subconscious mind was dealing with this information as I was sequencing the book. That's exactly what I wanted to discover. I knew intuitively, somehow, that our intuitions are that powerful. That we are constantly moving things we don't even think about around, like a little tiny figure scratching his head, probably mystified, like, holy cow, how'd this happen? You know, so I wanted to discover that and affirm it, and you know, you can embrace it in your own life. I'm sure you all have probably had something like that come up at a time or another, and especially if you think about it, you'll probably recognize it. So this was the first book when I did this kind of editing, and it was an experiment in finding relationships between pictures that weren't necessarily something you find in the caption. So there's 10 years between these 2 pictures. They're mirror images of each other. This one is outside looking toward the interior with reflections on the window. This is inside looking out with translucent figures coming in. And they're perfect together. I didn't contrive it. It just happened spontaneously. And through this process, I discovered that, you know, that had happened. You know, putting these 2 pictures together, I don't know why I think they work. I'll ask the critic. Is that okay?
Sure. Well, I mean, they both have a kind of amorphous mass of water and air with like sort of dim forms coming out of them more so, but they seem to me both about elements, you know, like the elemental qualities of water and air, and yeah, like so you're sort of trying to discern and make sense of things.
In my mind, I also think of them as, particularly in the context of this book, as a suggestion of travel.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is the English Channel. Okay, well, so this is the scale model that they had at this is actually an early picture in the series. I got very interested in models because it used to be when you go to visit the viewing deck on the World Trade Center, after you've been out looking at the real New York City from the viewing deck, which was amazing. Anybody experienced that in here? Yeah, a few people. It was amazing, right? Helicopters flying below you and little tiny stuff everywhere. And then you'd walk in and you'd walk by the scale model of the city of New York. And I noticed people were spending as much time looking at the scale model, they'd spend a half an hour looking at the scale model after they'd looked at the real thing. I said, well, that's interesting. And so I pretty seriously photographed it while I was up there. Let's see.
Well, I want to make sure we get time to talk
Yeah.
about
We want to get
this project.
We
And
will
so,
get there.
but so I like sort of skipping a bit ahead, but there's also, I feel like, speaking of intuition and kind of learning, I feel like part of what you're going to be learning in this project is like
Pass it around.
things about your own visions, things about your own intuitions, right? That you only discover in the process of seeing image after image after image that you've taken yourself. So like, where did the intuition to move to Matfield Green population, what, 47 at last count, or is that too generous?
Well, actually, we were 50, and then my neighbors had a baby, so now we're at 51.
Okay, I apologize for undercounting.
It's okay. Like, because a few years before I moved there, it was 47. So
Okay.
you might have looked up and got
Okay.
some old numbers.
But so yeah, so then where does the intuition to go to Matfield Green and work on this body of work for a number of years come from?
Well, in the midst of all this peripatetic exploring and finding this way of editing pictures and learning to trust intuition, when I was a boy, my brother was a falconer, and he took me out to the Flint Hills with him to hunt with one of his red-tailed hawks, and it just made a huge impression on me. And then I became a bicycle racer and would come out here to race and train, and it made another kind of impression on me because it's a fierce place to ride your bike, as I'm sure you've all witnessed. And then, you know, when I was a painter, I would also come out here to look, and I was especially interested in kind of color field minimalist painting, and so it was a great place to come and just take fields of color in. And then I became a photographer and came out and realized very quickly it was a lot harder to make a picture of the place that was beyond superficially pleasing, a picture that actually had something of the essence of the power of that place that I'd experienced, particularly as a cyclist. So whenever I was coming back to visit, I would always set time aside to come down here to the Flint Hills, oftentimes with my friend Doug, who's sitting in the audience there. And
It might be relevant to mention that you're from Kansas City.
yeah, well, my family's living in Kansas City. So whenever I'd come back to visit them, I would set aside time to come down here. And then when I moved from Brooklyn to be nearby my dad in 2008, I started coming out here more and more. And then in 2019, my dad passed away, and I found myself coming out here regularly. You know, that was a really intense year for a lot of reasons, and try to keep it brief, but I just found myself coming out here a lot. And then in the end of August, take that back, beginning of August 2019, an opportunity for me to move to Matfield Green came up, and I just did it. I found out about the opportunity Sunday morning, and Monday morning I resigned from my job. I had a good teaching job with health insurance and the whole deal, and I resigned from that. I'd gotten fed up with the job, but yeah, I just threw myself into it. A huge, insane risk. It was insane, but it turned out, once again, the intuition of it. I mean, what a great place to ride COVID out. You know, I don't know if I would have made it through COVID as a professor at the college. You know, I don't know. That would have been brutal. And as it was, you know, during that time, I was making work like this, and then I ended up getting a Guggenheim Fellowship based on the work that I'd made out here on up to that time. So, you know, long story short, sometimes you can trust your intuition.
I feel like if the arts teach us nothing, it's probably that. So this is something I've heard Philip talk about a lot, and I think it's very true that, and this is my experience too, of being in the prairie, being in the tall grass preserve, places like that near Matfield Green, where it feels one way and then you try to take pictures and it feels nearly impossible to convey the experience of being in there. So I was hoping with these images you could talk a little bit about how you think about, you know, capturing a place that is so difficult. And I feel like, and there are a number of things we can talk about. So color is one, and having worked with Philip, kind of watching him work on his prints, there's a range in my experience among photographers of the degree of care people take with their prints and adjusting them and tweaking them and getting them just right. And Philip is kind of on the very extreme end of like nothing is left to chance, and the degree to which I know he cares about getting the color and the texture, everything just right. So how, and you know, I don't know if there's one, you know, a few particular images that really stand out to you. One thing that I notice, like especially on these images, but it comes out in others too, I think it's very hard to make a Kansas landscape look dynamic, right? We are notoriously flat, and I feel like there are subtle but important things happening in these images where even the slight tilt of the camera relative to the ground, or the particular place, location you choose, where it gives it that slight rise, gives it a sense of dynamism that were it to be completely flat would make it a very different image. There's, you know, there's a subtlety of color that I think is doing a lot here. There are things you do with lighting, like in that image of the thorns in the very back, where my understanding is you're using a flash, right, an artificial light that kind of emphasizes the image. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to kind of devise an aesthetic for representing a place that's so hard to represent?
It wasn't, I didn't just go out there and say, I'm gonna use this aesthetic. It evolved definitely out of the work, of the experience of making the work, going back out on the landscape and understanding what about the work was inadequate relative to the experience of being there. I can say that this picture here, that I'm just so glad Trish wanted to include in the show, this is one of the first pictures I ever made of the Flint Hills that I felt started in a single frame to describe the space of it. And a lot of how I do it is pre-verbal, really. It's, you know, it's a question of understanding, you know, I can use a word like optics, you know, like how the field of view of the camera, whether it's a wide angle view or more narrow telephoto view. Well, you can use both to convey great spaces, but you have to put yourself in the right space to use them that way. The main thing is to have the experience of the space and then somehow bring out of photography a translation of that. And you know, I hate to tell you this, there's not a formula for it, you know. I could stand in that same place now and it probably wouldn't work, you know, maybe 1 out of 100 chances it would work.
How many hours do you estimate you've spent walking around in the in the environs of your home?
I reckon, okay, I'm not out photographing as much now. I'm kind of focusing on other things because after 6 years of being at it, you know. So figure five years, probably minimum 6 hours a day, 4 days a week. So it's 24 times 52 times 5. That's how many hours I was out there. But that's on top of a lifetime of coming out here and trying to photograph it, and you know, a slower process than living here where I can just walk out and do it. So it's very much that feedback of looking at the picture and no, that's not quite right. I should have been here, or if I'd gone here, or if this was that. And just kind of thinking through the possibilities, and then all of a sudden something happens where one evening I'm home editing the work and this comes up on the monitor and I'm like, wait a minute, the more I look at that, that really does kind of work.
When you edit,
And once again, I mean, it could be that some of you have a vision that is different, that when you see it, the space isn't working for one reason or another. But certainly if you were out there, you would be doing it differently. But you could still probably reveal something about the space that is intrinsic to it.
when you edit for things like color, are you looking to create something that's as true to what you remember seeing as possible, or does the photograph become a separate thing that sort of has its own life?
The photograph is absolutely a separate thing, but I base it in what I've observed. I start with rigorously, like, what color is the sky? Which, by the way, I don't know, I've talked to a bunch of photographers. It's the hardest thing to get the color of the sky right. It's so difficult to have it feel like light and still have color. You know, like, what color is the sky? What color, how does, you know, what color is it? But then, especially with time, a photograph is a separate thing, so it starts to invite other possibilities of, you know, tweaking the color another way to where it translates into a compelling photograph. You know, you're completely free to do whatever you want, but the problem I find is you're kind of too free. Like, there are just too many wet sliders and, you know, hue, contrast, saturation, luminance, you know, too many things you can do with color. So I have to stay grounded at the beginning, otherwise it just kind of flies off into irrelevance very quickly. And I ground myself in observations of the real world, and then observations of the work and how it's functioning. They can change after I show them to people. People notice things. And another thing, do we have any photographers in the audience? There's one, there's one. You ever notice when you're showing your pictures to people, you can kind of feel how they're feeling about the picture? Like, even if they're not saying anything, you know, you can tell whether or not they're connecting with it, or if they're looking at it going like, it's frustrating because it should be like this. You know, it's almost like a psychic thing. You know, I mean, I've showed my pictures to people so many times, particularly when I was in commercial photography, having meetings with art directors. You get to where you can really feel what they're thinking. And you know, honestly, what other people think does influence me, because I want to communicate with other people. You know, I want to be able to share this thing. As a matter of fact, I want to be able to advertise the vitality and the importance and the magnificence of this region.
But I do wonder about that too. I mean, I don't know if anybody else has this experience, but I feel like one side effect of living in a world that's so completely saturated with images, and with images that are very often trying to sell you things, is that we're so used to perfection and saturation and, like, you know, things that are dialed up to 11 in terms of their sexiness, to use a short term. And I feel like, if I were a photographer, which I'm not, but it would actually take a lot of discipline. And you know, in the questions that I shared with you earlier, but I feel like I think it would be very easy, especially in landscape photography, to veer into sentimentality, to veer into, it's just a little bit brighter than it was in real life, right? But it's going to make it pop. So I'm wondering if you think about things like that, like how do you...
Constantly.
Okay.
Constantly. And, you know, for me, you know, if there's one thing I want to rebel against, it's sentimentality, which is not to say I want the pictures to be emotionless, not at all. But there's this kind of overly sentimental schoolhouse, you know, with a saturated sunset behind it, or, you know, I don't want to express this, I don't want to express a nostalgia for the Flint Hills. I want to express the power of it and the vitality of it, you know. It can be quite ferocious. You know, there's one, the stormy sky over there. You know, that was a pretty intense night. But, you know, actually most of these are taken during days that were pretty darn pleasant.
But even though, I mean, one thing that I really, and I think I told you this, one thing that I really appreciate about, like, something like that central image there, like, it really viscerally captures, I think, both the image and the scale of it, how exposed you feel when you are in the grassland. I don't know, maybe, like, I've always identified with prey animals, not predator animals. And we recently got a rabbit, and we have a cat. I don't know, I've just been really thinking a lot, like, how fundamentally different the lived experience of a prey animal is. No, like, she behaves, our rabbit behaves so completely different from a way that, you know, we can identify with, because her primary concern is not to get eaten at all times, even though she's in our comfortable living room. I digress. But I feel like, but when I'm in the prairie, I feel like so exposed. There's nowhere to hide. There are no trees. It's also not a biome that I grew up with and sort of that feels natural to me. But I do feel like, yeah, it's sort of probably, but it takes kind of a conscious effort to see beauty in that, to see power in that, to come to appreciate it and to capture that. And that's something I really respect and appreciate about this body of work. Let me see. By the way, if somebody has other questions that I'm not asking, yeah, jump in.
Josh, have you said it first?
Yeah, I want to ask a question. Yeah, Philip, as you know, I mean, you hosted us in Maxwell Green, and I've been to some of these places I think are similar, you know, for part of Maxwell Green, like, and I've tried taking, you know, cell phone pictures, and you know, I always look at them afterwards and feel like I've just, the gravity of how unsuccessful I've been at capturing anything that I experienced. You're like dramatically more successful than I am, but I'm wondering if you ever feel that frustration also. And
Constantly.
Yeah, I'm wondering like what do you feel like, where do you run up at like against the limits of photography, and like what do you feel like you're not successful in capturing, or like where are your greatest frustrations in trying to sort of capture the power of your experience in photography?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is how hard it is. It's brutally difficult to photograph the wildlife that's out there. And I feel like that's crucial to this work. It's so hard. And I feel like I want to go further with that. But just
Can you
in
talk more
general,
about what the challenges are? And that was one of my questions too, because I think some of the most remarkable images are of living things
Mhm.
in the prairie, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that process.
yeah, well, so let me just quickly say there are a couple of things. I made a conscious decision about 3 years into the project to no longer include kind of obvious examples of human intervention. Like I've tried to keep, I don't edit them out in Photoshop by any means at all, or, you know, I don't twist myself into pretzel knots to contrive a way to not have evidence of human intervention in it. But I especially don't want to have evidence of ownership, because I firmly believe that nobody really owns anything. You do, we're in a capitalist society, I understand that's kind of how it works. But particularly when it comes to a piece of land, one of the local landowners, Jane Koger, is a rancher and a very devout conservationist, and she said, you know, I just want to live my life so I leave this place a little bit better for those that come next. And I think that's a really crucial thing. And I came to see after years fences and roads and all that as symbols of a kind of ownership that is degrading. Not always, but you know, oftentimes, and particularly in a photograph, then it evokes that. So once I wasn't photographing people or human intervention, it immediately became apparent to me that, wait a minute, there's this other civilization out there. You know, I really started to think about the wildlife as a parallel civilization to the one we live in. Particularly because I would start to observe their interactions more and more and learn more and more about not book reading, but watch what happens and, you know, how they behave. So what makes it hard? You know, understandably, you know, the relationships between humans, and you talk about predators, we're the ultimate predator, and all these animals, no matter how high up they are on the food chain, recognize us as such. So, you know, if I'm there, they want to be gone. They don't want to be my friend. And you know, I totally understand it. But on the other hand, I just feel this great affection. Honestly, I wish I was a vegetarian. Like, are you a vegetarian? No. You know, I just didn't grow up that way, and I haven't been able to change the habit. But yeah, observing the wildlife out there has given me intense thoughts of wanting to be a vegetarian. And so the other thing that makes it hard is that, you know, I don't have leather skin, and I'm not covered in fur, and it's cold and it's hot, and there are ticks and poison ivy, and you know, in order to get close, you have to be stealthy. I have a number of pictures. For a while, I was sitting in a blind. I had a camouflage blind, and I'd spent days. I spent probably a month sitting in that thing waiting for animals to come by. I realized that was not really efficient, and the pictures always looked like they were taken from a blind. So then I found this fantastic camera system that works with a remote sensor that's very discreet and doesn't disrupt them. Even that's difficult though, because you have to get it out there, you have to set it up very carefully. It doesn't work one day, and the next day it's a little better, and it's a process of refining
the deer,
it.
for instance, right?
The deer, yeah, and the heron.
Okay.
Yeah, the heron, when I saw that come up on the camera, I almost fell over backwards. It's just, I love that picture. What a stroke of luck. And the other thing, you know, I think probably 99.98% of all photographs have humans or human endeavor in them. And I just feel like we need to pay more attention to the world outside of us. And especially, I firmly believe we need to take better care of the world around us. Another thing is, anytime you see a grassland, you know, without some kind of human activity and intervention, pretty quickly grasslands either turn into a desert or a forest. So it's rare that there's a grassland that isn't by human design. So it's not like this is a completely untouched virgin landscape or anything like that. Of course, you know it's not. But you know, ever since the last ice age, the grasslands in the United States were managed by human intervention.
Like controlled fires.
Particularly controlled fires, but also indigenous cultures had a real keen sense of game management. You know, they knew not to, you know, wipe out the local deer herd or whatever.
I know there was another hand up there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you mentioned that there's a different aesthetic photographically you found from when you were in Paris as opposed to the United States, and I know that's true because geographically, I mean, Japanese photographers, for example, have a particular aesthetic. I think it's quite obvious. And but I'm wondering how you differentiate the aesthetic that you believe exists in this country as opposed to what you saw in Paris or Europe.
It's a very general kind of category that leaks. You know, there are a lot of exceptions, like there are a lot of European photographers that have real close influences and ties to American photography and back and forth. But I think in general, European photography is much less committed to the documentary style of photography, and they're kind of more open to, you know, staged kind of photography, and also a photography where there's a real heavy artist intervention. It's much more apparent in European photography than, you know, some kind of technique or something, you know.
You're thinking of like the Düsseldorf school, that?
For sure. Yeah, but even, you know, I mean, Cartier-Bresson is another story because he was sort of early on, but also his had a kind of a more romantic, he used a kind of documentary style, I guess you'd call it, but there was a much more romantic, emotional current in it. Which is not to say American photography is devoid of emotion, it's just cooler and more American.
Well, there are really compelling stories in this country of somebody like Jacob Riis or Louis Hine photographing human misery, but like with a specific kind of policy goal, right, and actually achieving it, which, yeah, now that I think about it, I can't think of parallel stories in the European or...
Really?
I can't, I mean,
I
it
can't
could
either.
it could just be a dearth of my knowledge, but yeah, no, as somebody who's reasonably familiar with the history of photography, I can't think of...
I can't either.
And actually, and I do think this is something I've been thinking about recently in terms of the history of American photography. It's really remarkable, I think, and this body of work, I think, is in that tradition, and we're thinking about it in that way, the degree to which photography had a shaping role in the way we think about the American landscape, especially the Western landscape, going back to the 19th century, and people like Carlton Watkins, for instance. And the thing that I didn't realize until very recently, but that it sort of became a self-fulfilling prophecy where photographers who were Watkins was photographing Yosemite, Jackson, I believe, was photographing Yellowstone, but then, so these photographers who are going out west to places where most people out east, where the bulk of the US population was at the time, would never go, and then these photographs make their way to Congress and end up actually being really, really significant documents. In both of those cases, the two most iconic national parks become national parks in part because there are photographers who go there and photograph them. So I think, yeah, it's an interesting facet of American photography. I've never sort of articulated it fully before, but I do think there's a tradition of photography, yeah, sort of trying to link up with, like I said, specific policy goals, or like a bit like what you were describing too, trying to make people see a place in a certain way.
And you know what, I think honestly that's part of what motivates me. You know, I do want these to be, you know, politically effective. I'm not lobbying Congress with them or anything like that, but I want them to be persuasive. You know, I want them to inspire people to care more for the Flint Hills, but also the world around them and each other.
Could you also comment about your title?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to keep it brief because I can see people are. I mean, I think you can see it in some of the pictures. You know, there's not just as above. You know, you see the clouds, and then you see below the silt in the water, or there you see the clouds reflecting in the water. You just see this interaction between the greater cosmos and the little microcosm of life. Like on all scales, there are these things. Well, it's like the book that there's a kind of thread through the book of different themes, and I think that works in, you know, in this terrain. You know, the relationships between one thing and another, and how everything works, and this kind of essential, almost mathematics that courses through all of the cosmos. You know, that's basically what it's about. And you know, the thing is, if you live in the Flint Hills for a while, you know, pretty soon you're going to be picking up a fossil that's 300 million years old, and then when the sun sets, you're going to look at the sky and you're going to see this unfathomably forever infinity of stars. So you're constantly kind of drawn into and becoming more and more intimate with these unfathomable, huge scales of time and space. And I think it's something we've been a little bit estranged from. You know, we're kind of closed into architectural spaces, the city lights kind of black out the night sky, and so I think our sense of scale as urban dwellers gets smaller, and when you go out there, all of a sudden, it opens up and you're intimate with this, once again, I would say otherwise unfathomable sense of scale. And so the title is meant to evoke that. But I think it's also interesting because it, you know, it is that alchemical, you know, tradition. I can't remember the exact history of how that's the central phrase of alchemy, but you know, turning lead into gold.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Like, so I didn't notice this until you just said this, but there's a clear binary or kind of dialectic between like sky and ground in almost all these images, or it's just sky. But when you said as above, so below, like, so that's one interpretation I have of what you said, like, you know, as above in the sky, so below on the ground is kind of unity between those two. But I guess another take, I'm curious which of these you respond more to, is that above is the nature beyond our sort of everyday experience captured in both sky and ground in your images, and there's something about our human subjective experience there's a correspondence there between, you know, self and nature that we miss and that you're sort of highlighting in these images. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm curious which of those or maybe some other interpretation you have.
I think both of those are accurate, and I think they come from, you know, some of the basic properties of human experience of having your feet on the ground and walking through, and the sky is up and the land is down, and you're observing these things. So I think both of those things are true. Any questions? Any others? Yes, ma'am?
Well, I think you've sort of answered this, but I'll ask it anyway. You said you weren't nostalgic about coming back, having lived other places, and they're beautiful, amazing images, and I don't see like an overt nostalgia to it, but I'm just curious if there are specifics about the place that you see with new eyes, having been someplace else that you can locate or pinpoint? Like without using a nostalgic lens from,
Yeah.
you know, this is what I remember about it.
Well, I think one of the reasons I wanted to move to Paris was because I don't think you can know yourself until you know what you're not. And I wanted to, you know, I really desperately wanted to learn another language, and I realized I wasn't going to be able to do that unless I lived somewhere where that I had to use that language every day to live. And I wanted to immerse myself in another culture. And really, if I would have had enough guts and been a lot smarter than I am, I probably would have moved to Asia, you know, to really have to learn a whole new alphabet and a whole, you know, everything completely different. But, you know, I had the chance to move to France, and Paris isn't so bad. I mean, it wasn't easy, don't get me wrong. It wasn't like I just skated over there and had a great time like the Marlboro Man or whatever. It was a struggle, but well worth it. And so, the experience of living in other places, knowing what this isn't, kind of helps me see what it is. And I just don't trust nostalgia anyway, because, I mean, I've lived there for, you know, I mean, life is what it is, you know, no matter where you live. I mean, I lived in one of the most glamorous neighborhoods in Paris, and there were days when I woke up and I was sick of it. You know, it was noisy, it was polluted, it was expensive, it was like all these things that you could complain about, and all my neighbors did complain about it. And, you know, I didn't that much, but there were times when it's like, man, this is rough. You know, yeah, I could tell you, like when my neighbor upstairs ran her bathtub over, and then, you know, the neighbors were renovating with jackhammers, and, you know, for weeks on end. So, you know, and in the Flint Hills, you know, like in the summertime, it can be 104 degrees for 8 weeks straight. So I just don't trust nostalgia, and that makes the moments when it opens up and it's like this that much more remarkable and worth communicating.
Are there, since we sort of talked a little bit about, and then maybe I'll say this last thing, unless somebody has a really burning question that they can't not ask. But are there things that, having been coming to this place for, what, 50-ish years?
Yeah.
Longer?
54 years.
Like sort of from a perspective of, you know, human-made climate change, are there things that that you notice being different between when you came here as a child and you living here now?
A lot more encroachment of forests. I mean, a lot more. And also the land is more divided up. There are a lot more houses, you know. It used to be more like towns with an occasional farmhouse here and there, but now, you know, like if you take Little Cedar Creek from Matfield Green out to Madison Road, there are 4 or 5 mansions, you know, like full-blown mansions. And one of them is inhabited maybe 2 weeks a year, you know, and so there's a lot more of that all throughout the Flint Hills. And what else? Cell phone towers, you know. I'm not able to photograph, when I'm photographing the night sky, if I include the horizon, there's all kinds of cell phone towers all around, which is part of it. And you know, I do have a picture that has a cell phone tower in the book from the horizon. It's okay. But yeah, those changes I've definitely noticed. And for sure the storms are stronger. I mean, wow. You know, definitely. The summers are hotter and the storms are stronger.
Could you just comment a little bit about your time with Irving Penn? Irving Penn, if I recall right, photographed used cigarette butts.
That's one of the things he did.
Which is not at all like what I'm seeing here. So can you just talk a little bit about your experience with Irving Penn?
Where to begin? He was an artist and completely in love with the arts. And he worked with a discipline that was exemplary, like a monk. He was very respectful of the people around him. At the same time, he knew that he was imbued with a particular talent. He liked to hear that people loved his photographs, but he was confident. He wasn't arrogant, but he was very confident, and he knew that he knew how to do what he did. And he was all about that. He was plenty generous, but also keenly focused on using the time that he had to make the best work that he possibly could. And it was really great to be around that. You know, it's been a huge influence on me. I aspire to it every day. Yeah. And there are times I wish, you know, the prints here only became possible about 12 years ago, 15 years ago. And these are the best prints that we've ever been able to make as photographers. The technology now is like worlds better than anything that's ever existed before it. And I just wish Mr. Penn had his chance to get his hands on this stuff. Oh man, he'd be having so much fun. He'd be thrilled with it, I'm sure of it. And if he wasn't, I'd help him be thrilled with it.
Do you ever paint anymore?
I don't. I get that question sometimes. I focus all my energy in photography, and I find that it satisfies everything.
Okay.
It's just as, you know, it's just as everything, except it's just got that factual, you know, the way optics work, it just keeps it grounded, the way I use it anyway. It keeps it grounded in the world, you know, and our common experience. And I don't know how to achieve that with painting. You know, it always, well, you can achieve it, but it's just not as
That's different.
connected, yeah.
So I see a lot of emotion, especially the two big photographs on either side of you right there, in what you're doing in the foothills. And it touches on that documentarian that we talked about earlier with Yellowstone and Yosemite, but it's more than that with the use of the clouds and the sky. And I can see just on this economy, as above, so below. I think when we go out, when I go out, the thing that catches me, well, I'm not a native Kansan, so the thing that catches me about Kansas is the sky. And no matter where you go, no matter what time of year, the sky is always right there. But once you start get beyond that, there's so much intricacy in the land around you too, and I think that's, you know, to your title and to the photographs around you, that's kind of what I see is that first the sky draws you in, but then the attention is in the land and the detail below it, so. Very nice.
Thank you. I'll just say quickly that the body of work I finished before I did this one was a kind of militant book about what I see. It is an emergency. We are in an environmental emergency. And so from 2013 to 2019, I did everything I could to make the most compelling depiction, I guess I would call it, or argument, for taking better care of the planet. And there are a lot of things that I really struggled with in this, like there's a certain anger in the book, but I didn't want it to be like, oh God, a diatribe, like you don't want to have to put up with the angry guy, right? But also it might be something that we might share, that there are times when you see like something being bulldozed, it's like, why did you have to do that, you know? It's kind of that feeling. And by the end of this book, I couldn't look at it anymore. And so that's when I evolved into this project here. But also, as I was making this book, I was constantly wrestling with the problem of, you know, when you're photographing something that is, you know, environmental degradation, photography has a way of making even the ugliest things beautiful. I mean, that's what advertising photography is all about. And whatever you photograph, you're kind of advertising it. So I really struggled with this work and how to make the work so that you could look at it, but it wouldn't glamorize the subject matter. And I found that very challenging and a very interesting challenge. But then by the end of it, I felt that I wanted to immerse myself in something that I could, like I said, kind of in a way advertise, which is the subject of these pictures. It's something that, you know, this is something that I want to be revised, and this is something that I want to be cared for, and I want it to endure.
Do you think it'll be here in 50 years?
You know, I don't know. I really don't know. And we should think about that. That's a hell of a thing. You know, this used to be, what, 44 million square, you know, and it's fragile. And there's, you know, there are a lot of landowners that are conscientious, a lot of them. I know of 60,000 acres that are under great conservation stewardship right now, like top notch. But that's not 44 million. which is not to say we need 44 million, and the world evolves and the world changes, I recognize that, but, you know, I think we need to take better care of the world, and now. Yeah.
I think we should end.
Well, thank you to both of our guests, and, you know, if somebody has a question,